oppose. Or in a few cases, they insult and belittle those who think the Soviets did not do it, or call them communists. This is not scholarship, but political propaganda, as though communists cannot be trusted, while by contrast, anti-communists, including the German Nazis, can be. Under such conditions, it is already a declaration of partisanship to acknowledge and discuss the controversy at all. The only objective way to approach the historical dispute about the Katyn massacre is to begin by acknowledging that such a dispute actually exists. The viewpoint that the Soviets shot all the Poles and that the Nazi report of 1943, aside from its anti-Semitic statements, is entirely truthful, is accepted without question by all anti-communists everywhere, including in Russia. And that's the official position of the Russian government, too. The viewpoint that the Germans shot all the Poles and that the Soviet Burdenko report of 1944 is the accurate one is accepted by some communists and pro-communists, except for Trotskyists, and by many Russian nationalists. In 1990 to 1992, Mikhail Gorbachev and then Boris Yeltsin claimed that the Stalin-era leadership of the Soviet Union had indeed shot the Polish officers, confirming virtually all the details of the anti-communist Polish nationalist version. In 1992, Yeltsin presented to Polish officials facsimiles of documents from, quote, closed packet number 1, that's the English translation of this collection of documents, which, if genuine, would put Soviet guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But beginning in 1995, some Russian researchers have argued that these documents were forgeries. Analysis of these documents, mainly by Russian researchers who reject the official version of Katyn, has continued ever since, growing ever more detailed and sophisticated. But long before this, positions on both sides had hardened. Among those who believed the Soviets guilty, very few changed their opinion on the basis of the new evidence. I count myself among the few, since I changed my own view, shifting from thinking that the Soviets did it to an agnostic position, to I don't know. Since 2010, much more important evidence has come to the fore that casts the strongest doubt upon the official version of Katyn. In Volodymyr-Volynski, Ukraine, it's a small city in Ukraine, Polish and Ukrainian archaeologists found evidence that at least 2 Polish policemen, believed to have been shot by the Soviets in April or May 1940, in or near Kalinin, Russia, were in fact murdered 700 miles away in the second half of 1941 by the Germans and their Ukrainian nationalist allies. That is, after the fascist invasion of the Soviet Union. This fact alone dismantles the official version of the Katyn massacre. This is the subject of my article here, which I'll get to subsequently. These discoveries illustrate how corrupt the history around the Katyn massacre has become, or I should say the historiography around the Katyn massacre. The discovery of the badges of these 2 Polish policemen, previously said to have been shot and buried 16 months or more earlier and 700 miles away, is by far the most important find at the Volodymyr-Volynski excavation. So why has it not received the publicity that it merits? Undoubtedly because powerful political forces in Poland and Ukraine do not want to publicize it, because it casts doubt on Soviet guilt. Therefore, it has been hushed up. The Polish archaeological report mentions only one of the Polish policemen's badges, and there are 2 such badges. Even that is buried in a footnote with only the most cryptic reference to Katyn. Literally a coded reference, understandable only to those who are extremely familiar with the Katyn issue. I discussed this in my article at some length. But the Ukrainian archaeological report does not mention the discovery of the Polish policemen's badges at all. The cover-up began before this, however. In October 2010, revelations of draft forgery documents were presented on the floor of the Russian Duma by Duma deputy Viktor Ilyukhin. Yet this dramatic story was virtually blacked out of the mainstream Russian media. Forget about the rest of the media. You never read about it in the New York Times or anyplace else either. The mass media outside Russia has completely ignored the 2010 discovery of the draft forgery documents, while the mass media outside Poland and Ukraine has ignored the Volodymyr-Volynski discoveries. There is good evidence that the Ukrainian nationalist forces participated in the mass murder of the victims at Volodymyr-Volynski. Meanwhile, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists is honored in Western Ukraine. Volodymyr Volynski even had a street named after OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalist leader, and Nazi collaborator Stepan Bandera, whose men participated in the mass murders there. Soviet guilt in the Katyn massacre is literally constitutive of post-1990 Polish nationalism. Poland has transformed Katyn into an anti-communist and anti-Russian orgy of veneration for its victims. Polish governments have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on hundreds of monuments and memorials to Katyn. Hundreds of ceremonies, some very large in scope, have been devoted to Katyn, as have hundreds or thousands of publications and the efforts of dozens of scholars. The official version of Katyn is taught in all Polish schools. In addition to the motive of anti-communism, Katyn is kept alive as a weapon to beat Russia with, for Russia is the heir to the Soviet Union. Poland continues its years-long struggle to have Katyn declared genocide and make Russia pay reparations to the families of the victims. There's John. Welcome, John. Yet now we know there was no Katyn, no single chain of events during which the Soviets shot the Polish prisoners of war. But Poland, Ukraine, and anti-communists generally do not want to acknowledge this. Much less do they want their own citizens of the world at large to doubt Soviet guilt at Katyn. The story of Katyn is a fascinating historical conundrum. Any similar event in, for example, American history would long ago have attracted the attention of scores of researchers, professional and amateur. But in Poland it is taboo to question, even for a minute, the official Soviets did it version of Katyn. Hence the cover-up and denial. What really happened? Although the Volodymyr Volynski discoveries definitively refute the official Polish version of Katyn, they do not tell us what really happened. The hypothesis that most closely fits the evidence we have today is that the Germans or the Ukrainian nationalist allies shot most of the Polish POWs. I go into much more detail in my book. Therefore, there was no Katyn massacre in the sense of the event known to history by that name. The Polish prisoners of war, officers, and others were killed, but probably in different places where their bodies have never been recovered, as the Volodymyr Volynski site itself remained unexcavated until a few years ago. You have to understand that in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, there are thousands of mass graves, and there is no attempt to systematically excavate them. And when they do excavate them, such as here, there is no attempt to do things like DNA analysis. That's the TV stuff. It's extremely expensive and extremely time-consuming. They don't have any of it. They just don't do it. Okay. Therefore, it is possible we will never learn any more. Neither Poland nor Ukraine, nor at this time Russia, nor any of the anti-communist powers, want to find any evidence that casts doubt upon the official version of Katyn. 5. The Warsaw Uprising. What really happened? This is the 1944 uprising. I'm not talking about the October 1943 Warsaw Ghetto uprising right now. Okay, that's in the book, but right now I'm talking about the Warsaw uprising. On July 31st, 1944, General Komorowski, commander of the Home Army, the Polish term is Armia Krajowa, but I'm going to use the term Home Army because we're speaking English here. Loyal to the Polish government in exile in England, gave the order for an uprising in Warsaw against the German occupying forces. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1st to October 2nd, 1944, was a disastrous defeat for the hugely outgunned and outnumbered partisan forces in the city. At least 17,000 insurgents were killed, while the Germans and their allied forces murdered, at least 200,000 civilian residents of Warsaw and destroyed 60% of the buildings of the city. That was Hitler's order to destroy the city. The uprising was directed militarily against the Germans, but politically against the Soviet Union, and especially against the Polish forces allied with the Red Army. The Polish Army, Wojsko Polskie, and the People's Army, Armia Ludowa. The uprising was a part of the Polish government in exile's Operation Storm, Polish Bursha. This plan was designed to try to seize power in Polish towns once the Red Army had crossed into western Byelorussia and western Ukraine, which the Polish government in exile still considered to be part of Poland, right? Poland had seized these regions by conquests from Soviet Russia in 1921, and they had been retaken in 1939 after Poland's defeat and merged into the Belarusian and Ukrainian republics of the USSR. Until the early 1990s, the Polish government in exile continued to insist that these lands were part of Poland. Operation Storm was designed to present the Soviet government with the necessity of either recognizing the Polish government in exile or having to arrest its authorized representatives, thus admitting that it was a conqueror and not a liberator. The plan was for home army forces in the towns. This is the plan. The plan was for home army forces in the towns to wait until the Red Army was on the point of liberating a town from the Germans. In the interval between the German troops' withdrawal and the arrival of the Red Army, the home army was to come out of hiding, occupy the government buildings. When the Red Army arrived, the home army was to greet them as the lawful government and representatives of the government in exile. When the Red Army removed them from office and replaced them with their own Polish forces, the home army was to inform the government in exile, which would then make a formal protest to the Allies. The Allies would then, supposedly, make a protest to the Soviet government. No one ever thought that the home army and other partisan forces in Warsaw would be able to defeat the German and Allied forces there. These included, the German forces, included at various times parts or all of 5 tank divisions, one of them an SS division, the German 9th Army, a company of the 29th SS Grenadier Division, the Sonderkommando Dirlewanger, infamous for its savagery against civilians, and a number of Cossack and other forces recruited from the anti-communists within the Soviet Union. These forces were supported by Messerschmitt fighters in Stuka Dive-Bomber. The only chance for success for the Warsaw Uprising then was to count on the Red Armies defeating the German forces and driving them out of the city. Then, with a minimum of fighting against retreating troops, the Home Army hoped to take control of Warsaw and present the Red Army with an accomplished fact. The Home Army leadership started the blame game, pointing fingers at others during the uprising itself. At first, they tried to blame the British. Then they decided it was all the Soviets' fault, despite the fact that the uprising was supposed to be directed against the Soviets in the first place. One person, Komorowski, the Polish commander, never blamed was himself. But a great many other Poles, including anti-communists and his own Home Army members, did blame him and continue to do so. 6. Stalin's alleged anti-Semitism. The subtitle of Bloodlands, this is Snyder's book, is, quote, Europe between Hitler and Stalin. It supposedly concerns the years 1933 to 1945, when both Hitler and Stalin were in office. So why is there a whole chapter about the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1953, after Hitler's dead, right? Evidently, Snyder thinks that to seal the comparison, really the equation, between Hitler and Stalin, you must contend that Stalin was anti-Semitic, since Hitler was anti-Semitic. Since neither Stalin or any of his anti-communist scholarly facilitators could find evidence of Soviet anti-Semitism between 1933 and 1945, they must try to find it after the war. In this, they follow a path laid by previous anti-communist writers to whom this idea had already occurred. In Blood Lies, that's my book, I examined Snyder's account of the murder of Solomon Michoels in January 1948, the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, and especially the Doctor's Plot. These are events in the Soviet Union. I examine all these issues using the latest research and revelations from the Soviet archives. I cite a lot of evidence that Stalin strongly opposed anti-Semitism. This includes the book by Zhores Medvedev, Soviet dissident and brother of Roy Medvedev, a well-known figure, whose book, Stalin and the Jewish Problem, 2003, addresses this head-on. It's only available in Russian. Medvedev concludes that Stalin was not anti-Semitic, though he was anti-Zionist. Anti-Semitism did, of course, exist within the Soviet Union. It had probably grown during the war, since much of the Soviet population had lived for 3 or more years under Nazi occupation and been subject to intense anti-Semitic propaganda. But the evidence is clear that Stalin strongly and consistently opposed anti-Semitism, and I've got chapter and verse and lots of evidence in my book. Conclusion, but this is not the conclusion of the talk. The anti-communist scholars, I have quotation marks around scholars, but you know, They have all the resources of libraries, archives, and the money of their capitalist states behind them. If there were in fact any crimes of Stalinism, it is impossible, I believe, that such dedicated anti-communists would not have found evidence of them. The fact that the professional anti-communist scholars like Professor Timothy Snyder of Yale University repeat nothing but lies is the best evidence we are ever likely to have that there were no crimes of Stalinism. I have some things to say in conclusion of my talk about objectivity, bias, evidence, and how to interpret evidence. Because these are crucial matters, right? There is, of course, much more to say about these 6 anti-Stalin lies. Then there are literally dozens of other lies in Snyder's book, all with references to anti-communist Polish, Ukrainian, or German scholarship. I have studied them all and proved them all to be baseless. I must say I was somewhat surprised. Nevertheless, I think it will be worth your while to read about them. They illustrate the different strategies of falsification employed by Snyder and other anti-communist writers. This is so important that I devote a chapter towards the end of the book to analyzing and categorizing the different types of falsification, right, in Snyder's book. There are other questions which I don't directly address in the present book, such as the Moscow trials, how to use evidence provided by confessions, the issue of torture, the issue of Leon Trotsky's allegations and writings. I hope we can cover some of these matters during the question and answer period, if you're interested. I think the Q&A is as important as my presentation, since in it I can attempt to respond to the questions and issues that are of most interest to you, the audience. However, before ending my presentation, I think it's important to say something about 3 issues that always come up and that are central to the study of Soviet history of the Stalin period. These issues are the following. 1, the question of objectivity and the lack of it in historical study. 2, the general ignorance of most readers, including most Marxists, about how to evaluate historical evidence. 3, the effect of anti-communist propaganda, especially from supposedly left sources such as Trotsky, Khrushchev-era and Gorbachev-era Soviet writers, and from anti-communist Russian researchers today. So I'm going to talk about these 3 matters. Objectivity. Everyone has biases, but everyone can learn to be objective and study any subject, whether it be physics, biology, or history. The techniques are basically similar. Objectivity as a scientific method is a practice of distrust of the self. It's other things too, but distrust of the self is very important. One can learn to be objective by training oneself to become aware of, to articulate, and then to doubt, to subject to question, one's own preconceived ideas. One must be automatically suspicious of evidence that tends to confirm one's own biases, prejudices, and preferences. One must learn to give an especially generous reading, to search especially hard for, to lean over backwards, so to speak, to consider evidence and arguments that contradict one's own preconceived ideas. Objectivity is a practice like learning a foreign language. You can become good at it through practice, by deliberate effort. You must do this if you want to learn the truth. And we Marxists want to learn the truth. You know who you are. Sure, Marxists. You want to learn the truth. Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, "The proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains." Remember that? By that I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free, if we are the international working class. Marx's favorite slogan was, "De omnibus dubitandum," question everything. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. And you must question your own preconceived ideas and biases above all others. Moreover, it's what every bourgeois detective at every detective story knows. As Sherlock Holmes used to say, keep your mind free of precipitate conclusions. Get the facts before you form your hypotheses. Be ready to abandon a hypothesis that does not explain the facts you have established. If you don't do this, if you don't try to discover the truth from the very beginning, from the outset, then you are not going to stumble across it by accident along the way, and you won't discover the truth. A common form that this lack of objectivity takes is the demand for certainty. For example, we have a great deal of circumstantial evidence that Leon Trotsky did in fact collaborate with German and Japanese intelligence. I published an article about this some years ago. It's on my webpage. How can this evidence be accounted for except to conclude that Trotsky did in fact collaborate? The most common way is denial. There is no certainty, therefore it is false. There is a lot of denial in the study of Soviet history. Second, evidence. I find that most people, no matter how intelligent and well-read, do not know how to interpret historical evidence. Nothing surprising there. Most people have never given it much thought. But many people on the left who have some formal education somehow believe that they do know how to evaluate historical evidence, and they don't. One example is the argument from incredulity. I get this a lot. This fallacy takes the general form, quote, I can't believe this, or this is incredible, therefore it is not true. The fact that you disbelieve it is a statement about you, not about the evidence. People tell me all the time, Grover, if you can't convince me, then your argument is faulty. Intelligent people say this to me all the time. Trotsky, who knew all about this, often utilized this argument to great effect. Who could believe that I would ever join a bloc with Zinoviev and Kamenev? I attacked them often and vehemently in print and would never have anything to do with them, Trotsky wrote many, many times. Trotsky and other anti-communist writers could, by the way, we have discovered that there was a bloc, right? You can read all about it in my book, but there certainly was a bloc, right? From the Trotsky archives, we know that Trotsky wrote about it secretly. But he denied it many, many times over. Trotsky and other anti-communist writers could never get away with dismissing the Moscow trial testimony as incredible unless they could rely on the fact that their readers were ignorant of the fallacy of incredulity. This kind of thinking is partly due to ignorance of logic and how to interpret evidence. I think, too, that the arrogance of us intellectuals plays a role here. We think we are such smart people. So if we are not convinced, it is not because we are at fault, but the argument that is at fault. This is a very common error. A couple of other examples. The use of first-person narratives as primary sources. Somebody wrote somewhere that something happened, so it must be true. The historiographical principle being flouted here is, this is Latin, testis unus, testis nullus, meaning a single witness or testimony cannot ever establish an historical fact. Trotsky knew, just to pick Trotsky as an example, he's far from the only one. Trotsky knew and utilized this fallacy frequently. Two examples. Trotsky claimed Lenin said that Stalin was, quote, a cook that makes only peppery dishes. That's what he claimed. Trotsky also claimed that Lenin's wife Krupskaya told him, Trotsky, that, quote, if Ilyich, Lenin, were alive today, he would be in an OGPU prison. Trotsky is the only source for these stories. Yet many readers, and of course anti-communist writers, accept them as true because they are convenient to their anti-Stalin bias. The appeal to, here's another example of a fallacy, the appeal to torture as denial. Okay? Well, they were tortured, like the Moscow trial. Right? Well, they were tortured, so what they said isn't true. The fact is, we need evidence that somebody was tortured. We can't just assume it. B, tortured people can either tell the truth or lie. C, people who are not tortured can also either tell the truth or lie. Therefore, even if we can establish that someone was tortured, that does not tell us whether what he testified was true or false. And the same thing is the case with those who are not tortured. All right? So torture is like a smoke screen behind which you can hide, you know. Another point. An important principle recognized by all objective historians is the following. Quote, lack of evidence is not evidence of lack. That is, the fact that there is no evidence something happened doesn't mean it did not happen. In the case of conspiracy, where the conspirators plan to leave no evidence at all, that's what makes it a conspiracy, right? Lack of evidence is what we should expect. That is, there is no evidence in the German and Japanese archives that Leon Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, therefore it is false, right? But of course that's not logically true. Another example. The prosecution in the three Moscow trials of 36, 37, and 38 claimed that there was a block of rights and Trotskyites. Just get this. That's what the prosecution claimed, right? Read those trial transcripts. They're all available. Very seldom read, but you can buy them very cheaply. They claimed there was a block of rights and Trotskyites. Trotsky himself vehemently denied this many, many times. So did his son Leon Sedov in a whole book. He wrote a book called The Red Book of the Moscow Trial. Denied this many, many times. Under Khrushchev, Soviet researchers claimed that they had scoured the archives and found no trace of such a block. By 1980, then, the universal consensus of Trotskyite, Soviet, and Cold War historians was that the block was a fabrication by Stalin. In 1980, the Trotsky archives at Harvard University were open to researchers. Within a few months, the research team, headed by Pierre Brouet, the foremost Trotskyist scholar in the world, discovered that letters by Trotsky and his son Sedov in the archive confirmed the existence of a block of rights of Trotskyites, formed with Trotsky's permission. The Trotsky archives had been purged. That is, incriminating materials had been removed at some time. This purging was imperfectly done, so that Brouet was able to confirm a number of lies by Trotsky, including Trotsky's repeated and vehement denial of the block. So Brouet admits that Trotsky lied. But now listen. Suppose the Trotsky archive had been purged more carefully, so that no evidence of the block remained. That was clearly the intention of whoever purged the archive. All the so-called authorities, Soviet, Russian, anti-communist, and of course Trotskyist, would still be claiming that the block was a Stalinist falsification. Yet it still would have existed. The only thing is we would not have incontrovertible evidence from Trotsky's own archives that it did exist. So you see the problem of how lack of evidence is not evidence of lack? Important. Okay, another issue. Anti-communist propaganda and research. All of us are seriously affected by anti-communist propaganda, even when, maybe especially when, we are not aware that we are being affected by it. Much of this has to do with what is called the big lie. Repeat something over and over again, get different so-called authorities to repeat it, so that it appears to come from different sources, decorated with scholarly-looking footnotes, and people with scholarly-sounding affiliations get the mass media to accept it as factual, and it will be believed. This is especially the case with Stalin-era research, since there are sources with a left cover, Trotskyist, Khrushchevite, Gorbachevite, who give the propaganda a kind of credibility among leftists that blatantly Cold War propaganda could not get by itself. Trotskyism was a small and shrinking sect until Khrushchev gave his secret speech in 1956. My first book is on Khrushchev's secret speech. According to Trotsky admirer David North, that is what gave modern Trotskyism its biggest boost. Since then, Trotskyist writers cite Khrushchev and post-Khrushchev Soviet writers as evidence, because the Trotskyist line about Stalin and Khrushchev's is pretty much identical. My first book in 2007, English edition 2011, is Khrushchev Lied. It is important to know, of course, that Khrushchev's secret speech is virtually 100% made up of falsehoods, most or all of which were deliberate. Even more important is what this fact implies. What else did Khrushchev and the Khrushchev-sponsored writers like Moroy Medvedev and Alexander Nekrich and many others, what else did they lie about? The answer is they lied about pretty much everything else about the Stalin years, even about very minor issues, let alone the important ones. Moreover, Khrushchev-era and then Gorbachev-era sources were and remain the bedrock of contemporary Russian, Western, and Trotskyist research. Of the former, Western, I mentioned Robert Conquest, whose works were at the forefront of anti-Stalin and anti-communist phony research for 30 years. Of the Trotskyists, take the work of Vadim Z. Rogovin, the most important Trotskyist research of the Stalin period. These writers rely almost exclusively on these Khrushchev and Gorbachev era works. Just like Western's Cold War historians, Rogovin and other Trotskyist historians simply accept Khrushchev and Gorbachev era fact claims as unproblematically true. There is no source criticism, and no criticism of any kind. If an allegation makes Stalin look bad, into the footnote and the narrative it goes. Yet another good example of how ignorance of proper research methods, in this case source criticism, dovetails with bias and a lack of objectivity to produce false historical narratives, lies, with scholarly-looking footnotes. These three matters: a failure to adhere to objectivity in historical study, ignorance of how to gather and interpret historical evidence, and anti-communist propaganda from left sources account for the fact that the history of the Stalin period of the Soviet Union is so seriously misunderstood. I continue to devote my efforts to studying Soviet history of the Stalin period as objectively as possible, while